Welcome to Never Again Is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. In today's episode, we will discuss anti-Semitism in the music industry. I'm Evelyn Marcus, and in addition to being a psychologist, I am featured in the documentary about anti-Semitism, Never Again Is Now. I am a Dutch Jew and the daughter of Holocaust survivors. In 2006, I emigrated to the United States because of the rising anti-Semitism in Europe.
I am Phyllis Zimbler-Miller, the founder of the free nonfiction Holocaust theater project, TheEdgeTheWedge.com. I grew up in the Midwestern town of Elgin, Illinois, where our parents and grandparents had come to the United States to escape the Tsar and other pogroms. And yet, in 1970, only 25 years after the end of World War II, my U.S. Army officer husband and I found ourselves stationed in Munich, Germany, and it changed our lives forever.
Winston Marshall is a British musician, songwriter, and podcaster. He was the former banjoist and lead guitarist of the British folk rock band Mumford & Sons. With Mumford & Sons, he has won multiple awards, including a Grammy. He has been credited as the father of the new folk scene in Britain. He left the band after he started to openly express his opinion about current affairs in society. In his podcast, Marshall Matters, for the renowned British political magazine The Spectator, he explores, quote, the taboo and totemic issues within the creative industries in a series of interviews with artists, musicians, actors, comedians, and more. Close quote. Winston, it's wonderful to have you on our show. Welcome.
Ladies, Evelyn, Phyllis, thank you so much for the invitation. A pleasure to speak with you both.
So our show is all about speaking up against anti-Semitism, and you are such a great role model on speaking up in general. Can you please share with us what happened when you were still at Mumford & Sons and started to openly speak your opinion? What were you openly speaking about? What were the reactions? What were the choices you made?
Well, as you have described, I was a co-founder of the band Mumford & Sons, which we formed in 2007 and which we enjoyed 14 wonderful years together and made some records I'm very proud of, 4 albums and several EPs, and had the good fortune of touring the world. And it was my childhood dreams come true, a wonderful experience and a project I remain very proud of. And but I had to leave last year, as you suggest, in 2001. Through the pandemic, I'd been tweeting about books I'd been reading and putting on my Instagram, social media, books that I found interesting or relevant, or some of them classics. I read Mao's Little Red Book and Tolstoy's War and Peace and everything in between. One of the books I tweeted about was by American conservative journalist Andy Ngo, who documented far-left extremism in the States over the last couple of years, so contemporary far-left extremism, namely in or specifically rather, the BLM riots of 2020, Antifa movement, and the incidences involving them. For example, the 19 deaths in the first 14 days of the BLM riots, the federal courthouse in Portland under siege and on fire for months on end. And this, it so happened, somehow, at this point feels like a bit of an act of God, blew up on Twitter and became #1 trending item for the weekends that I tweeted it. And I guess I didn't think much of it, realize, or I certainly didn't anticipate what was going to happen, but I think I must have crossed one of those invisible tripwires, and it turned out that Antifa and BLM are one of those totemic issues where it is taboo to criticize and or even question. So, for example, in the music industry, shortly after George Floyd's killing, everyone put up a black square with links to Black Lives Matter, the organization. Now, this was so, this became a picket line. It's such a passionately held position in the music industry that if you didn't post a black square, you were deemed to be against the movement. An example of how one might say insane this situation was, there was a band called Hanson, you might remember, and they famously had a song go bap bap bap. I think it's called Bap. They didn't exist. They'd broken up and so didn't post a black square because they didn't exist, and their fans were so upset that they didn't, that the band had to get reform just to apologize for not having posted a black square. So you get a sense of the climate. So I didn't quite realize this, and this book that I tweeted about got me in trouble. And long story short, I had to quit the band. The band were getting in trouble. Radio stations were saying they weren't gonna play the music. I was dropped from DJing at a festival in the UK, and all this backlash for essentially having the wrong opinion. And so now that I sacrificed my job there, I've seen it almost as my duty to speak out on totemic taboo topics. This has included anti-Semitism. This has included Israel and Palestine. This has included and continues to be BLM, as I've mentioned, and Antifa. But there are other issues, like the trans debate now is one of those issues. Environmentalism is one of those issues. I just had Michael Schellenberger, author of Apocalypse Never, former Democrat, California gubernatorial candidate, come and speak about environmentalism. That seems to be one of the topics. You mustn't criticize Greta Thunberg, of course, matron saint of eco-anxiety, as far as I can tell. And so anyway, I now have a podcast called Marshall Matters with The Spectator. It's a British political magazine. I think it's actually the oldest political magazine in the world, oldest continually running. It's about 200 years old. And ironically, a very respectful magazine, given how within the music industry, my opinions were so anathema and unpopular, but actually in normal society, apparently not so much. So I've been exploring those topics now, and I still continue to make music. I'm just at the end of a US run performing songs. I've been in California, New York, and Arizona, and I'm now in Georgia, playing some of the songs I've written over the last 15 years, and having a great time doing it.
That's great to hear. So from what you tell us, it seems that you haven't so much realized that you didn't so much choose to speak up in a so-called politically incorrect way, but it happened without realizing it, and it had big consequences for you. Is that correct?
I think that's fair to say. Yeah, I hadn't given it much thought, but now I'm in such a position where I really, it would be stupid not to speak my mind. And I do think a lot of people self-censor. There's a serious climate of self-censorship at the moment. I know so because I've had hundreds, if not thousands, of private messages of people, not just in the creative industries, but across society, saying they can't speak their mind on the list of topics I just listed earlier. And so I do think there's a responsibility to those people. People in my position should be addressing those topics, because if we can't, then no one can. Yeah, I mean, even in anti-Semitism, look, I had one interviewee I had on my show was Tracy Ann Oberman, and I think you should invite her on your show. She's wonderful. She's a British actress, Jewish, and she describes to me, and she's actually written about this, and I think it was in the Jewish Chronicle, but she describes to me in the interview how when it came to Israel-Palestine, whenever that issue has flared up in the public imagination in Britain or in the West, for whatever reason, Jews, regardless of what they actually think about Israel Palestine, they might not be in favor of Israel. They might not even be Zionist, but they feel like they have to keep quiet about their background and their identity because people make assumptions about them, and they've even experienced, and she describes, political purity tests in theatre and drama in the UK, where in whatever you'd have reading rooms, I'm not quite sure how it works, but these topics come up instead of work, instead of going through the script, instead of actually working on their craft, they're having these political conversations because people feel like they need to bring up the politics at work so often now. And they're scared to speak their mind because it's such a divisive issue, I guess. Anyway, that's an example of what's going on in the creative industries.
Wow.
I think that, let me just say that's a good lead into this question that I wanted to ask you, because although you have a Jewish mother, you identify as being a Christian. So are you the recipient of anti-Semitic remarks at work or privately? If so, what's happened and what's been your reaction?
So I was raised by a Catholic mother and a Protestant father. My mother's mother was a Holocaust survivor, and they were Jews from Transylvania who left late 1942 and escaped first. They went through through Germany. I have her diaries documenting the whole thing. Should have been about 13, 14, 15. And they went through Germany and Switzerland, eventually to France, and then to Portugal for the remainder of the war. And after the war, settled in Paris. So my mother's French Catholic, and she was raised French Catholic. And there's a whole other story there about my family and why the history of our faith and religion tied in with the ethnic. It's complicated. The best way I have of describing it briefly is to reference Sir Thomas Stoppard's play Leopoldstadt. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this play, but it shows a Jewish family in Austria, and it covers them through the generations from the turn of the century through the First War, Second War, and then after, and as well as dealing with the difficulties of memory, repressed memories, false memories, and the like. I think, which is Freudian in some respects, but that he also deals with why some Jewish families, well, in that play, the family, the sons will have brises and baptisms, and
I've read the play.
You've read the play, and part of the reasons for that, and it's complicated, but part of the reasons for that, which I've never fully understood until seeing that play, is that before the war and at various times in history, Jews have wanted to be a part of society, and so take on these cultural rituals or even religious rituals, but as a way of trying to assimilate. Although, of course, that hasn't gone very well. So that play actually really, it's so similar to my family, except that mine were from Hungary and what is now Romania, because Transylvania became Romania after the war.
Exactly.
And so then they ended up in France and eschewed their Jewish cultural background, though that of course they were Jews. They were Zellingers, Davidovich, and but they changed their name to hide their Jewishness, which I know other families like that. It's not an uncommon story.
No.
So I was raised Catholic, Protestant, but I'm British as well. And so the second half of your question, I think, that's just a bit of background, but the second half of your question is to remind me, is it about anti-Semitism in the music industry? Forgive me.
No, directed directly at you.
Have I experienced anti-Semitism?
Right.
I'm very sensitive to seeing anti-Semitism. I have experienced anti-Semitism, although I was rather surprised that the person I was working. It wasn't an. It was a tricky experience because I was working at a food bank in the pandemic, and when you work at food banks, you there's a lot of people who really struggling and really suffering, and you have some people with mental ill health, and I think that there was one person who was I would say probably an alcoholic, not very well, and he I don't know how he could have known that I had a Jewish background, but he came in and there was a black girl next to me and we were working, and he goes to her, he starts berating her of the N-word, and then he goes to me, we should have finished you off in the showers, and and using other anti-Semitic tropes. And I mean I don't know what I wasn't wearing a kippah, so I don't know quite how he knew that about my family history, but I obviously got triggered by that because 13 members of my family, my grandmother's cousins and aunts and uncles, were killed in Auschwitz, in the death marches, and in other camps. So it was quite shocking to me, and of course it was also shocking what he said. But to be honest, outside of that, I haven't explicitly experienced anti-Semitism. Phyllis, you raise your hand.
What did you say when the person said it?
Well, it's a very tricky thing when you're in a food bank, because people are suffering, and it's not. Although my blood boiled and I was ready to hit the guy, I contained it, and I gave him a warning. I said, "Take that back, or the police will be here shortly." And but he just wasn't of sound mind, so he was just getting angry, and then I had to protect him from the other women who were there. So we basically had to kind of shoulder him out in a loving way as well, because it was run by a church. There's some tricky dynamics to run in a food bank like that, and you have to be loving. It's there's without it being accepting of what he said. But anyway, it was a tricky situation, but it de-escalated. Let's put it like that.
It's great that you managed to say something. When your blood is boiling and you are in an environment where you cannot unlimited have your own reaction that you would prefer. I think it's a great accomplishment that you managed to say something.
Yeah, I think. He could have. If it had continued to escalate, when you're, this is a side point, but if you, in that situation, your duty is to de-escalate conflict. Yeah. And it's not a normal situation to be in, because also remember, we were in the pandemic. There was high stress, surrounded by a lot of poor families who were stressed, and so you've also got to be an example. Everyone can see each other, what's going on, and so you have to focus big picture about de-escalation. So but maybe that's a good example for everyday life. I'm not sure, but I think it probably would have gone differently had it not been at a food bank. But that's maybe it was a good thing that it de-escalated. It was a good thing it de-escalated as it did. Yeah. That's the only time I've experienced anti-Semitism directly, although I've seen a lot of anti-Semitism, particularly in the music industry, and I've had friends on the receiving end of anti-Semitism. We at the time of the clear example of this, at the time of Black Lives Matter in June 2020, there was a lot of anti-Semitism tied up with that. And famously, one of the famous examples was the American rapper Ice Cube tweeting the Mere One mural. If you're not familiar with this mural, it's a sort of graffiti mural by an artist called Mere One, and it's a trope. I think it's a bunch of elderly men with Jewish tropes in their features over a Monopoly board on the top of I guess I can't remember exactly, but sort of slaves and anyway, it was the same mural that Jeremy Corbyn, former leader of the British Labour Party, initially complimented. Then I think he criticised it, but said he had a right to free speech, and then eventually was forced to condemn it properly. It's the same mural, and Ice Cube tweeted that, and it got, I think, 50,000 likes or something. And Louis Farrakhan is tied in with some of those guys. You'll see them link, and he's the head of Nation of Islam in America, and he's a history of anti-Semitism, not hard to dig up. And then in Britain, there was a rapper called Wiley who went on a huge anti-Semitic tirade. It was a bizarre sort of, he was running around London, live streaming the whole thing, blurting out just disgusting anti-Semitic stuff. And within that, he even named some Jewish friends of mine. And then actually, just to full circle on that, we've got just recently, Kanye West has been making some very anti-Semitic statements, and so there has been a little bit. Now, I wouldn't say Kanye West has got anything to do with BLM, so I'm not linking BLM, the organization, directly with anti-Semitism, but I would say that there is an anti-Semitism problem in the music industry, for sure. And I already described what Tracy Ann Oban, the British Jewish actress, had to deal with, but I also get a greater sense of self-censorship by Jews in the creative industry, and I know this because earlier this year I published a piece for the Jewish Chronicle about a band called Big Thief, the bassist of whom is Israeli, and they'd booked 2 shows in Tel Aviv, I think, and then withdrew the shows because BDS had got to them somehow. And I wrote about this piece condemning BDS and the various anti-Israel organizations set up by musicians and artists, and there are a few, and very popular groups. And after publishing, the amount of private messages I got from people within the industry saying, thank you for speaking, because I can't say it. So there's a self-censorship that's going on, certainly, when it comes to anti-Semitism, when it comes to Israel and Palestine in the music industry.
And Winston, is the BDS movement active in the industry? Does it have an influence there?
Yeah, so just for reference, there's a group called Musicians for Palestine, which launched in 2021. It's an anti-Israel collective of over 600 members. A total of 1,524 signed the Artist Pledge for Palestine, vowing to boycott Israel. That was also in 2021. Artists for Palestine UK, a group advocating for cultural boycott of the Jewish state, enjoys the support of Brian Eno, Roger Waters, Ken Loach, and over 1,500 others. So there are several groups tied in with these. There are many artists who support these anti-Israel groups. I would argue that some of them, and I've just mentioned Roger Waters, have it's not just anti-Israel, that it's anti-Semitic, and because it's of course legitimate to be critical of the behavior of Israel, of the Israeli state. But I would say that a lot of these people go a lot further, and they explicitly support BDS. Now, I've experienced BDS firsthand myself.
How?
A friend of mine, Baba Mal, who happens to be Muslim, from Senegal. He's like the Bruce Springsteen of Senegal. Everyone in Senegal knows who he is. And if you ever meet a Senegalese, wherever you are in the world, if you want to see them smile, sing them a Baba Mal song. Like, this guy he's king of Senegal, and a great friend, and he actually sang at my wedding, and he booked a couple of shows in Jerusalem. I forget what year this was, but maybe 5 years ago. And as soon as he announced, I was getting phone calls from BDS activists saying, put me in touch with Baba Mal. We've got to make sure he doesn't do this show. Firstly, the BDS activists assumed I would agree with them that Baba shouldn't do the show. Secondly, they assume, well, firstly, I had, thirdly, well, secondly, they assume that, well, I don't know how they got my number, but they got my number. So what was clear about that incident for me is how they work. They come after the artists and they scare them. And they bully them. Actually, there's a great artist called Nick Cave who's very brave, and actually, like me, I think he's one of very few other artists to talk about Antifa and far left extremism and criticize them. He said about BDS that BDS made him want to play Israel because he doesn't like to be bullied, and that's what BDS are. They're bullies. They don't accept Israel as a state. They say this fairly explicitly on their website. They say we don't advocate for a one or two state solution, and they don't acknowledge the right for Israel to exist. And so Nick Cave had the courage to stand up to BDS, but more often than not, I would say BDS are successful. And what happens, and this is classic, it happens year on year. A huge artist will announce a show in Israel. They may even do the show for charity, as Big Thief did, American-based band with who I've already mentioned, with the Israeli bassist. The money to be raised for Palestinian charities, and actually, I think that's a great way to do it. And it's not without its problems, but it's a good start. And usually, often that's the case. And then BDS come after them. The artists cancel, and then they make a groveling apology, saying they have to learn more, they need to listen more, or something like that. And it's completely cringeworthy at this point.
So
it's a cliche, actually.
So they turn the public expressions of the artist into apologies for performing in Israel, and because they didn't know enough about the problems there.
Well, quite, but I mean, who are we kidding? Like, okay, I'm not saying that these artists are geniuses, but if you're going to be a successful artist, you're probably fairly smart within your domain at least. And there's no way that they're going to get booked, or that their booking agent is going to say, look, you can do Israel, but you're going to get some pushback. Yeah. You know you're going to get pushback. Yeah. So they announce it. They've done a lot of thinking already. They've thought about it. They thought about what we're going to do this. So for them to suddenly have this turnaround, it's what changes, right? It's not that they've done more thinking. No, what's happened is the BDS are trying to create a media shitstorm for them, create a PR disaster so they look bad, and spook them out of playing. And it's absolutely classic. I mean,
destroy their brand.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I want to give a plug for the Creative Community for Peace here in LA. I went to the gala a few weeks ago because they apparently started 10 years ago because of anti-Semitism in the music industry. So we do have some effort on the other side.
That's true.
But it's not enough. It's just not enough.
That's true. And I forget which organization he's from, but I believe Gene Simmons of KISS is involved with it's not, I'm not sure it's just pro-Israel, but I think it's pro-Israel and pro-Palestine organizations. It's certainly a more centrist or a more conciliatory organization than these explicitly anti-Israel organizations. So I shouldn't paint a picture that it's completely dominated by anti-Israel. There's certainly some pro-Israelis, but I would say the majority are anti-Israel, and that there's a pretty strong groupthink on the issue, which is quite surprising because there's a lot of Jewish people work in the music industry. But I think that those Jewish people are being forced to self-censor.
And does this have a big effect on the opinion of the audience, you think? Is the audience becoming more anti-Israel or anti-Jewish because the artists are, you think?
That's an excellent question. It's hard to know, but I think I would imagine that that's split by generation. So different generations have different group think on it. I would say the younger generation, let's say 15 to 25, are probably majority pro-Palestine, anti-Israel. And but I'd also say that Israel-Palestine is such a complicated issue that anyone who tells me they understand Israel and Palestine, I know immediately that they do not understand Israel and Palestine, because it takes pretty smart people to come close to even understanding it, because it's such an ancient problem and conflict, and it's not something that's easily understandable. So given that it's so complex, and most people who are forced or force themselves into having an opinion on so many issues, given it's so complex, I think a lot of the thinking is outsourced, as I'm guilty of doing that in my own ways and in different topics. They outsource to people that they respect or admire. A lot of the time that is musicians, so artists, and so those people do have a sway, do have an influence, and it can affect it. But I certainly have, I felt personally that Israel-Palestine within the creative industries, it's pretty anti-Israel. It's been my personal experience, but I might be swayed there by availability heuristic, by confirmation bias, or rather just what I'm hearing, and
okay,
I'm not sure.
And Winston, a few weeks ago, you interviewed in your podcast the American Black activist Candace Owens about Kanye, or Ye West. She knows him well, and she said she doesn't know him as an anti-Semite. But if we leave Kanye's intentions aside and just look at his words, at what he literally said about the Jews, do you think his words will stimulate anti-Semitism in a large amount of people?
Well, that's a good question. So amongst other anti-Semitic statements he made, he said he was going to go DEFCON 3 on all Jewish people, I think is the quote. He linked black abortions to Jewish record label managers, and made the classic trope of linking Jews to controlling media. Will he have an effect? Well, there was some signage on a highway. Someone made some sort of banner, anti-Semitic banner. I forget the exact thing, in Los Angeles. Was it Los Angeles? Somewhere in California.
Los Angeles on 405. It said Kanye was right. Or and it, you don't know how what name they used for him, but was right.
So he's certainly had an impact, but he's also lost a lot. Adidas dropped him, which has cost him $1.5 billion. Gap have stopped stocking his trainers, sneakers, Yeezys, and various other partners. I think JP Morgan and others have said they will stop working with him. So there's been a backlash, to say the least. Will he have a big impact on society? It's hard to tell. The condemnation he's received, maybe not specifically from the music industry, but certainly from his partners and wider society, seems to me that he's not going to get an unchecked support. He certainly already hasn't. I couldn't possibly say whether he'll get large support. I haven't got a good sense on whether people at home are quietly nodding, thinking, yeah, Kanye was right. I don't think so, but it's hard to know.
I would just like to say that one of the things that we've been talking about is that word control, and that in answering anti-Semitic comments, that we need it to find a way to say, yes, Jews have prominent or leadership positions in some industries, and in many cases there are historic reasons, such as the film business. Jews were willing as immigrants to take the risk, but having leadership positions does not mean control, because clearly control is usually used with a malicious intent, like whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that perhaps you could give us insight as to how we could all kind of answer when people say, oh, Jews control the music industry. Do you have any hints for how we can deal with that?
Yeah, well, there's several problems. Let's just break down the trope. Firstly, it assumes that the Jewish people, the Jews, are all working as one, an organized people, and of course they're a culture and they're an ethnos, but then they're not an organized group. It ignores the fact that millions of Jews are poor and working people and don't have any control of anything. But then also, it's quite normal to see different ethnic groups thriving in different particular fields, and there's many reasons for that. And it's not because of control. It's because maybe natural talent or natural interest. And, you know, for example, I forget, there's the winners of the long distance marathon runners for decades now have all come from a very specific spot in the eastern highlands of Africa. Now, that's not to say that the people from the eastern highlands of Africa are controlling the marathon running. No, it just happens that they are talented in that particular task or that particular skill. So yeah, you've said it exactly right. Like, how do you jump from that to control? And control, that word implies something pernicious, something malicious, and it kind of falls apart, I think, as soon as you actually start to apply critical thinking.
Yes, and one of the things we've been thinking about is saying to people who say that, well, what do you mean by control? And kind of staying calm and asking that and seeing if they can define it so that we can then calmly say exactly the very insightful things that you said about not one monolith and what, you know, we need to get them to actually say what they mean, because they're just frequently just repeating a trope, so that we can answer it.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, this is, perhaps I'll get into territory that's more contentious, but when in 2016, 2017, I was living in America, I was living in New York, and this phrase white privilege kept coming up again and again. And it really rubbed me the wrong way, because it assumed that all what they said, white male privilege, they're all dominating in these fields, ignoring, of course, the white homeless men on the street. And but why it particularly irked me was because this was the same thing that was being said of the Jews in the 20s and 30s in Germany, that, oh, look at these Jewish people, they're dominating and they're controlling in these fields. Because what people are doing is they're just taking a substrata within a group and then associating them with the top positions, but ignoring everyone else within the group and whatever struggles they might be having, and wherever they are in whatever careers they happen to be at. So it's a very cheap, low resolution thinking, I think, that goes behind.
Generalization. It's a generalization.
Yeah.
Evelyn, do you want to ask one more question, as our time is coming to an end, and we want to give Winston a chance to say last thoughts? He's been so elegant. I hate to cut this off, but we want to make it a length that people will be happy to listen to. So, go ahead, Evelyn.
So, do you have any recommendations, Winston, for listeners who want to speak up against anti-Semitism in the music industry or elsewhere?
Well, the first thing I recommend is that fortify yourself. Make sure you understand the topics and the literature and that it's complex stuff. Go into it gracefully, because we've got to remember that the people with anti-Semitic opinions, they might hold those opinions, but they are humans and they just need to be corrected, and or their bad thinking needs to be corrected. And that, so if you can go into it with an element of love and grace, or let that be the starting point anyway, and that's worth remembering, because it's very easy to get upset and angry on this topic. So going into it trying not to be upset and angry, and realizing that we all make mistakes, that we've got our own blind spots, and we might not see everything. And actually, if it's tied into Palestine and Israel, that's like a very difficult topic, and trying to understand the plight of the Palestinians is a really important part of that. And I think that shows goodwill in coming it from another angle. And then specific things to do, try and find organizations that represent your opinions, that you feel like you can get behind, and find, reach out to people. Don't be scared to reach out to people you admire. You know, a lot of people have their DMs open on Twitter. I do. And, you know, you can speak to people and ask for advice, and look at and try and find people who have done it the right way, and in the way you'd like to do it. Reach out to them. They'll I'm sure, contact you. And the world is a lot smaller than you might think. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's certainly, reaching out to people certainly helped me.
I think that's a really beautiful way to end. And we thank you so much, Winston, really, for coming on our show. We thank our listeners. For anyone who hasn't watched the really engrossing documentary about Evelyn, Never Again Is Now, you can see it on Amazon and YouTube. You can read more about my nonfiction Holocaust theater project at thinedgethewedge.com. And as we close every show, we say, please, without putting yourself in physical danger, speak up against anti-Semitism and all hate.